February 14th, 1929. Chicago. The city that never sleeps is about to witness the most brutal massacre in organized crime history. 7 men walk into a garage on North Clark Street. Only one walks out alive. The walls are painted crimson, bodies lie twisted in unnatural positions, and the snow outside turns red with blood. This isn't just another gangland killing. This is the day that changed everything between 2 of America's most notorious crime bosses. Al Capone and Bugs Moran have been at each other's throats for years, but what happened in that freezing cold garage would echo through the corridors of power from Chicago to Washington, D.C. The man who ordered this hit thought he was ending a war. Instead, he started something far more dangerous.
By the end of this video, you'll understand how 7 men became pawns in a deadly game of chess between criminal masterminds, why the sole survivor's testimony would haunt law enforcement for decades, and how this single morning would ultimately bring down America's most feared gangster. Make sure you're subscribed, because this story will change everything you thought you knew about the golden age of organized crime. To understand why 7 men died in that garage, we need to go back to the world that created monsters like Al Capone and George Bugs Moran. Chicago in the 1920s wasn't just a city, it was a powder keg wrapped in jazz music and illegal whiskey. The Volstead Act of 1919 had made alcohol illegal across America, but it didn't make Americans stop drinking. Instead, it created the greatest criminal opportunity in the nation's history. Picture Chicago in 1925.
The skyline is growing taller every month. Construction cranes dot the horizon like mechanical giants, and the streets pulse with an energy that's part excitement, part desperation. Legitimate businessmen rub shoulders with bootleggers in speakeasies hidden behind barber shops and flower shops. Police officers accept bribes as casually as they accept their morning coffee. Politicians campaign on reform while their pockets bulge with mob money. Into this chaos stepped Alphonse Gabriel Capone. Born in Brooklyn to Italian immigrants, Capone arrived in Chicago in 1919 as a 20-year-old punk with scars on his face and murder in his past. But he had something most thugs didn't have: a brilliant criminal mind wrapped in the body of a natural-born leader. By 1925, he controlled the south side of Chicago like a medieval king controlled his kingdom. His organization wasn't just a gang, it was a corporation with departments for bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, and violence. Capone understood something that most criminals missed. Crime wasn't just about breaking the law. It was about controlling territory, managing cash flow, and maintaining relationships. He paid his taxes, donated to charities, and made sure his public image stayed polished. When reporters asked him about his business, he'd flash that famous smile and say he was just giving people what they wanted: beer, entertainment, a good time. But Chicago was too big for one man to control, no matter how smart or ruthless he was. The North Side belonged to a different kind of criminal entirely. George Clarence Bugs Moran was everything Capone wasn't. Where Capone was calculating, Moran was explosive. Where Capone courted publicity, Moran preferred shadows. Where Capone built an empire, Moran ran a tight crew of killers who specialized in hijacking Capone's liquor shipments. Moran had earned his nickname honestly. He was buggy, unpredictable, dangerous in ways that made even hardened criminals nervous. Born in Minnesota to Polish and Irish parents, he'd been running cons and stealing cars since he was a teenager. By the mid-1920s, he controlled bootlegging operations from the north side all the way to the Canadian border. His crew included some of the most feared gunmen in Chicago: Vincent Drucci, who could kill a man with his bare hands; Jaime Weiss, who'd survived more assassination attempts than anyone in the city; and Peter Gusenberg, whose loyalty to Moran was absolute. The war between Capone and Moran didn't start over territory or money. It started over respect. In 1926, Moran's crew hijacked a convoy of Capone's beer trucks worth $50,000. In today's money, that's over $700,000. But it wasn't about the money. It was about the message. Moran was telling Capone that the North Side would never bow to the South Side, no matter how powerful Capone became. Capone's response was swift and brutal.
3 of Moran's men were found floating in the Chicago River with their throats cut. The message was equally clear. Nobody steals from Al Capone and lives to tell about it. What followed was 2 years of escalating violence that turned Chicago's streets into a war zone. Moran's men would ambush Capone's deliveries. Capone's soldiers would burn down Moran's speakeasies. Bodies piled up on both sides. The newspapers called it the Beer Wars, but for the men fighting it, there was nothing amusing about watching friends die in puddles of their own blood. By 1928, both sides were exhausted. Moran had lost Jaime Weiss to Capone's gunmen. Capone had survived at least 6 assassination attempts, including one where Moran's crew shot up his headquarters with machine guns while he was eating lunch. The violence was bad for business. It attracted federal attention. It made customers nervous about visiting speakeasies. Something had to give. That something was George Bugs Moran's decision to make one final, decisive strike against his enemy. The plan was simple in its audacity. Moran had learned that Capone was expecting a massive shipment of Canadian whiskey on February 14, 1929. The shipment would be stored temporarily at the SMC Cartage Company garage at 2122 North Clark Street. 7 of Capone's most trusted men would be there to oversee the transfer. If Moran could eliminate those 7 men in one stroke, he wouldn't just be stealing Capone's liquor, he'd be cutting the head off the snake. What Moran didn't know was that Al Capone had been expecting this move for months. Capone's intelligence network was legendary throughout Chicago. He had informants in every major gang, corrupt cops feeding him information, and even federal agents on his payroll. When Moran started making inquiries about Capone's operations near the Clark Street garage, word got back to Capone within hours. But Capone didn't just want to defend against Moran's attack. He wanted to use it. He wanted to turn Moran's aggression into Moran's destruction. So instead of moving the meeting or increasing security, Capone did something far more clever. He leaked false information about an even bigger shipment, one that would require Moran himself to be present. The trap was set with the precision of a Swiss watch. Capone's men would pose as federal agents conducting a raid. They'd order everyone in the garage to line up against the wall, and then, instead of making arrests, they'd open fire with machine guns. By the time real police arrived, Capone's killers would be long gone, and the North Side gang would be history. On the morning of February 13th, Moran gathered his most trusted lieutenants at his headquarters above a flower shop on North Broadway. The room smelled of roses and gun oil. Maps of the North Side were spread across a wooden table, marked with red X's showing Capone's known operations. Moran's eyes were bright with anticipation as he outlined the plan one final time. Peter Gusenberg would lead the team. His brother Frank would provide backup. Adam Heyer, Moran's accountant and business manager, would be there to evaluate the stolen liquor. James Clark, Moran's brother-in-law, would handle security. Albert Weinshank would coordinate with their contacts at the garage. Johnny May, their mechanic, would make sure the getaway cars were ready. Dr. Reinhard Schwimmer, a young optometrist who hung around the gang for thrills, had begged to come along. 7 men. 7 lives about to be cut short by forces they couldn't see coming. That evening, Moran walked through the North Side like a general inspecting his troops before battle. The streets were covered with fresh snow, and the temperature was dropping toward 0. Neon signs reflected off icy sidewalks, and steam rose from manholes like ghosts. Moran stopped at each of his speakeasies, each of his gambling dens, each of his brothels. Tomorrow, he told his men, everything would change. Tomorrow, they'd own Chicago. What nobody knew was that 3 blocks away, Al Capone was making his own final preparations. If you're enjoying this story, do me a favor and hit that like button. It helps more people discover these incredible, untold stories. And stick around because what happens next is absolutely wild. February 14th dawned gray and bitter cold. The temperature had dropped to -5 degrees overnight, and the wind coming off Lake Michigan cut through the city like a knife. Chicago woke up slowly, reluctantly, bundled in coats and scarves, in the kind of determination it takes to face another winter morning in the Midwest. At 9:30 a.m., Peter Gussenberg arrived at the SMC Cartage Company garage. The building was narrow and unremarkable, squeezed between a boarding house and a small factory.
Inside, the garage was dimly lit and smelled of motor oil and cigarette smoke. A single truck sat in the center of the space, surrounded by tools and spare parts. This was supposed to be where Capone's men would bring the Canadian whiskey. This was supposed to be where the North Side gang would finally gain the upper hand in their war with the South Side. Frank Gussenberg arrived 10 minutes later, stamping snow off his boots and complaining about the cold. The Gussenberg brothers were Moran's most reliable killers, men who'd survived dozens of shootouts and never backed down from a fight. They'd grown up on Chicago's streets, learned to use their fists before they learned to read, and developed the kind of loyalty that only comes from shared violence. By 10 a.m., all 7 men were present.
Adam Hare was going over numbers in a small notebook, calculating how much the stolen liquor would be worth on the black market. James Clark was checking and rechecking his pistol, a nervous habit that had kept him alive through 3 gang wars. Albert Weinshank was pacing near the front windows, watching for the Capone delivery truck. Johnny May was under the hood of a getaway car, making last-minute adjustments to the engine. Dr. Schwimmer was trying to look tough and mostly succeeding in looking terrified. What they didn't see was the black Cadillac that had been parked across the street since 8 a.m. What they didn't notice was the man in the heavy overcoat who'd walked past the garage 3 times, each time speaking quietly into a telephone. What they couldn't have known was that every move they made was being watched, recorded, and reported to Al Capone's headquarters. At 10:15 a.m., a dark sedan pulled up outside the garage. 4 men got out. 2 were dressed as Chicago police officers, complete with badges and winter coats. 2 wore civilian clothes, but carried themselves with the unmistakable authority of federal agents. They walked toward the garage with the confident stride of men who had every right to be there. Inside the garage, Albert Weinshank saw them first. He called out a warning, but it wasn't the kind of warning that saves lives. It was the kind that gets people killed. "Police raid," he shouted. "Everyone stay calm. Let me handle this." The 4 men entered the garage with their weapons drawn but not threatening. The 2 fake policemen announced that this was a federal investigation into bootlegging activities. Everyone needed to face the wall with their hands up. No one would be hurt if they cooperated. This was just routine. The 7 members of Moran's crew exchanged glances but complied. They'd been through police raids before. They knew the drill. You paid your fines, spent a night in jail, and went back to business. The worst that could happen was a few months in county lockup. They'd all done worse time for smaller crimes. Peter Gussenberg was the last to turn toward the wall. Something felt wrong. Real federal agents didn't usually work with local cops. Real raids involved more men, more noise, more chaos. But by the time his instincts kicked in, it was too late. The 4 killers were already in position. What happened next lasted less than 30 seconds, but would be remembered for decades. The 2 men in civilian clothes produced Thompson submachine guns from under their long coats. The fake policemen drew pistols. There was a moment of absolute silence, the kind of silence that comes just before thunder, just before earthquakes, just before the world changes forever. Then the garage erupted in gunfire. The Thompson guns fired at a rate of 600 rounds per minute, but time seemed to slow down as the bullets found their targets. Peter Gussenberg was hit first, the impact spinning him around as blood sprayed across the brick wall. Frank Gussenberg threw himself sideways, trying to reach his own weapon, but 3 bullets caught him in the chest before he'd moved 2 feet. Adam Hare dropped his notebook and raised his hands, trying to surrender, but surrender wasn't an option. The bullets cut him down where he stood. James Clark attempted to draw his pistol, but never cleared leather. Albert Weinshank was running toward the back door when the gunfire caught up with him, sending him tumbling into a pile of spare tires. Johnny May was crawling under a car when the shooting started. He made it halfway to safety before a burst from one of the machine guns found him. Dr. Schwimmer, who had no business being in that garage, who was there only because he thought gangsters were exciting, died still clutching the medical bag he'd brought in case someone needed first aid. The killers didn't stop shooting until their weapons were empty. Then they reloaded and fired again. They wanted to be absolutely certain that no one would survive to identify them. The noise was deafening in the enclosed space, a thunderclap of violence that seemed to go on forever. When the shooting finally stopped, the silence was even more terrible than the gunfire had been.
Smoke hung in the air like fog, the smell of gunpowder mixed with the metallic scent of blood. 7 men lay motionless on the concrete floor, their bodies twisted into unnatural positions, their blood spreading in dark pools that reflected the dim overhead lights. But then, impossibly, one of the bodies moved. Frank Gussenberg had been hit 14 times, but he was still alive, barely conscious, bleeding from wounds that should have killed him instantly. He somehow found the strength to crawl toward the wall. His breathing was shallow and labored, each breath a monumental effort of will. The 4 killers didn't notice. They were already walking toward the door, confident that their job was complete. The fake policemen were escorting the fake federal agents out of the garage at gunpoint, maintaining the illusion that this had been a legitimate arrest gone wrong.
To anyone watching from across the street, it looked like 2 criminals were being taken into custody by law enforcement. They drove away in 2 separate cars, leaving behind a scene that would haunt Chicago for generations. Frank Gussenberg lay dying in a pool of his own blood, surrounded by the bodies of his friends and colleagues. He could hear sirens in the distance, getting closer. He knew he had only minutes left to live. He also knew that the code of the streets demanded silence, even unto death, especially unto death. The first police officers arrived at 10:47 a.m., 32 minutes after the shooting began. Sergeant Thomas Loftus pushed open the garage door and stepped into a scene from hell. Blood covered the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. 7 bodies lay where they'd fallen, some face down, others staring sightlessly at the fluorescent lights.
But one of the bodies was still breathing. Loftus knelt beside Frank Gussenberg, who was conscious but fading fast. The sergeant could see at least a dozen bullet wounds, any one of which should have been fatal. He asked Gussenberg who had done this, who was responsible for the massacre. Gussenberg looked up at him with eyes that were already seeing another world. His voice was barely a whisper, but his words were clear. "No one shot me. I ain't no copper." Those were the last words Frank Gussenberg ever spoke. He died 3 hours later at Alexian Brothers Hospital, taking the truth about the St. Valentine's Day massacre with him to the grave. The news of the massacre spread through Chicago like wildfire. By noon, reporters were crowding around the garage, taking photographs that would appear on front pages across America.
By evening, federal agents were swarming the North Side, questioning everyone who'd ever known Bugs Moran. By the next morning, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre was the most famous crime in American history. But George Bugs Moran wasn't among the dead. He'd been running late that morning, delayed by a phone call from one of his lieutenants about a problem at a speakeasy on the West Side. When he finally arrived at Clark Street, he saw the police cars and the crowds and knew immediately what had happened. He drove past the garage without stopping, and by the time the real police started looking for him, he was already 50 miles outside Chicago. Al Capone, meanwhile, had been in Florida for 2 weeks. He had witnesses, hotel receipts, and photographs proving he was nowhere near Chicago when the shooting occurred.
When reporters asked him about the massacre, he expressed shock and sadness that such violence could happen in a civilized city like Chicago. He offered a reward for information leading to the arrest of the killers. The investigation that followed was a masterclass in corruption and incompetence. The Chicago Police Department had been so thoroughly infiltrated by organized crime that they couldn't tell the difference between real evidence and planted clues. Federal agents found themselves investigating cops who were on Capone's payroll, interviewing witnesses who'd been paid to lie, following leads that led nowhere. But the massacre had consequences that Al Capone never anticipated. The sheer brutality of the killings shocked even a city that had grown accustomed to gang violence.
Public opinion, which had been tolerant of bootleggers and their wars, turned decisively against organized crime.
Politicians who had been content to take mob money and look the other way suddenly found themselves under pressure to do something, anything, to stop the violence. More importantly, the massacre attracted the attention of the federal government in ways that Capone's previous crimes never had. President Herbert Hoover personally ordered the Treasury Department to make Al Capone their top priority. If they couldn't get him for murder, they'd get him for tax evasion. If they couldn't prove he'd ordered the St. Valentine's Day massacre, they'd prove he'd never paid taxes on the millions he'd made from bootlegging. The man who'd thought he was ending a war had actually started a much larger one, a war between the federal government and organized crime. A war that would ultimately destroy everything Capone had built. Bugs Moran survived the massacre, but his organization never recovered. Without his top lieutenants, without the fear and respect that had kept his enemies at bay, the North Side gang crumbled within months. Moran himself fled Chicago and spent the rest of his life as a small-time criminal in other cities, never again wielding the power he'd held in the 1920s. The 7 men who died in that garage became symbols of something larger than themselves. They represented the cost of America's experiment with prohibition, the price of trying to legislate morality, the inevitable result of creating black markets that could only be controlled through violence. Frank Gusenberg, who survived long enough to refuse to name his killers, became a legend in criminal circles.
His final words, "No one shot me," were quoted in speakeasies and pool halls for decades. He'd upheld the code of silence even as he lay dying, even when cooperation with police might have brought justice for his murdered friends. The garage at 2122 North Clark Street was demolished in 1967, but the memory of what happened there lived on. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre became the defining moment of the Prohibition era, the event that showed America the true cost of the war between gangsters and government. Al Capone, the man who'd ordered the killings, was convicted of tax evasion in 1931 and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. He never stood trial for the massacre, but everyone knew he was responsible. The 7 deaths in that garage had finally given the government the motivation it needed to bring down America's most notorious criminal. In the end, the massacre accomplished exactly the opposite of what Capone had intended. Instead of ending his war with the North Side gang, it started a war with the federal government that he couldn't win. Instead of consolidating his power, it marked the beginning of his downfall. Instead of securing his empire, it guaranteed its destruction. The blood that stained the garage floor on February 14, 1929, was more than just evidence of a crime. It was proof that even the most powerful criminals are ultimately powerless against the forces of justice, even when that justice takes years to arrive. If this story amazed you, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on. We're bringing you these deep dives into history's most fascinating moments every single week. Drop a comment and let me know what you thought. Should Moran have seen the trap coming? What would you have done if you were Frank Gusenberg in those final moments? In next week, we're covering the incredible true story of how a single photograph brought down the most powerful crime family in American history. You won't want to miss it.